the sun beat down upon the frontier town, turning the hard-packed earth of the main street into a haze of dust that clung to boots and stung the eyes. Wooden saloon doors creaked on their hinges as men drifted in and out, their laughter coarse, their boots heavy on the warped boards of the porch. Wagons rattled by, their wheels throwing up trails of powder that mixed with the smell of sweat, whiskey, and horse. It was a place where mercy was scarce, and laughter came often at the expense of the weak. From the far end of the street came a figure so small and fragile she barely seemed real. A girl, no more than 12, shuffled forward barefoot, the soles of her feet blackened and raw from miles of dirt and gravel. Her dress, once light cotton, was now threadbare and patched with stains of dust and hunger. In her arms she carried a bundle wrapped in faded cloth, clutched as if it were treasure. It was all she had left of her mother. A scarf, a keepsake, a memory she would not surrender no matter how sharp the hunger gnawed at her belly. The townsman saw her and smirked. One spat tobacco into the dust, another nudged his companion with an elbow. "Look at that ragged little crow," one sneered. "Lost her ma and looks like a stray dog." Laughter followed, harsh and cutting, bouncing down the street like thrown stones. Another man tossed the crust of stale bread he'd been chewing into the dirt near her bare feet. "There's supper for you, beggar girl," he jeered. The crowd erupted again, finding humor in cruelty. The girl stopped, shoulders trembling, but did not bend to pick up the scrap. She tightened her hold on her bundle, her knuckles white, her lips pressed shut, though her eyes burned with unshed tears. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her cry, though her thin frame shook with the effort of holding it all inside. The street around her filled with jeers, every laugh a reminder of what she had lost. Her mother's voice, once soft and steady, was gone. The only comfort she had left was pressed tight to her chest. And yet in that moment, surrounded by dust and mockery, the cruel injustice of the town stood plain for all to see. A child with nothing but a memory, facing a world that had forgotten kindness. Nights were always the hardest. In the silence of the prairie, when the wind pressed against the boards of the abandoned barn she sometimes called home, the girl would lie awake clutching the thin bundle of cloth that once smelled of her mother's hands. Just weeks before, that gentle touch had smoothed her tangled hair and wiped away her tears. But fever had taken her mother swiftly, as it had so many before. Her father had vanished years earlier, chasing work or freedom, never to return. Death and absence were all she had known, and now even memory seemed fragile. A whisper on the wind she was desperate to hold on to. With no family left, she wandered on trembling legs to town, her belly aching with hunger that never eased. She searched alleyways for scraps, sometimes fighting stray dogs for a gnawed bone or the peel of a potato tossed aside. When brave enough, she stepped into the street in daylight, hoping for kindness. But in a town where every family struggled to fill their own plates, she was seen as nothing but another burden. "Another mouth to feed," they said, turning their backs before she could even beg. Her body bore the truth of that cruelty. Her ribs showed beneath the torn fabric of her dress, each breath pressing against skin stretched too thin. Her feet were blistered and cracked, the soles hardened from miles of wandering barefoot across dirt and stone. Her small hands were red and raw from clinging to her bundle, as though letting go would mean losing her mother all over again. And yet, even in her silence, her eyes betrayed something the townsfolk could not kill. Wide, dark, and glistening, they carried a flicker of hope. Not for riches or rescue, but for a single moment of kindness. Each jeer and each cruel laugh bruised her spirit, but did not extinguish that fragile light. When others looked at her, they saw rags and weakness. But behind the smudges of dirt on her cheeks lived a courage too stubborn to fade, even in the face of shame and hunger. The burden she carried was not only hunger and loss, but the weight of being unseen. A child with no voice, no place, standing alone in a world that mocked her need and hardened itself against her tears. Still, she endured, silent, trembling, but unbroken. The sun hung low above the frontier town, casting long, sharp shadows across the dusty street. The laughter of the gathered men carried harshly, bouncing off weathered saloon walls and shuttered storefronts. The girl stood small and trembling in their midst, clutching her bundle tight to her chest, her bare feet leaving faint prints in the dirt. For a moment there was only the cruel chorus of jeers, Then the swinging doors of the saloon creaked open, and the lawman himself stepped into the street. The sheriff was a broad man with a thick belt and a badge polished bright, though his eyes had long ago dulled from years of looking the other way. He took in the scene, the motherless child surrounded by sneering faces. For an instant there was silence. A hope sparked in her chest that maybe, just maybe, he would intervene. Instead, he tipped back his hat and let out a booming laugh that joined the men's cruelty like a hammer striking the final nail. "Well, look what we got here," he said, voice dripping with scorn. "Town's got no place for beggars and orphans. Best crawl back to whatever hole you came from, girl." His words cut deeper than the hunger gnawing at her stomach. The crowd roared approval, emboldened by the authority of the badge. One of the men stepped forward and, with a smirk, nudged the bundle from her arms. It tumbled to the ground, the precious cloth unrolling in the dust. She scrambled to her knees, desperately gathering it up, her small fingers trembling as the men laughed louder. Another townsman gave her a shove with the heel of his boot, sending her sprawling face first into the dirt. A gasp rose from her throat, muffled by dust, and when she lifted her head, her cheeks were streaked with grime and silent tears. The sheriff crossed his arms, shaking his head as though her very existence was an inconvenience. "You hear me, girl? There's nothing for you here. Best be gone before someone takes pity enough to run you out proper." His words rang final, sealing her humiliation. The crowd roared again, the jeers sharper, the laughter crueler. Around her, the faces blurred into a wall of mockery. Her small shoulders shook as she clutched her bundle close, a last defense against a world intent on crushing her. She was on the edge of breaking. One more shove, one more word of scorn, and the fragile hope burning in her eyes would be extinguished forever. From the far end of the street, the sound of boots against the dust cut through the laughter. Slow, steady, unhurried steps. Yet with each one, the jeering voices began to falter. A tall figure emerged from the haze of sun and grit, his hat pulled low, his coat weathered by years of wind and trail dust. He didn't need to bark or threaten. His silence carried more weight than the sheriff's badge. The cowboy's eyes locked on the scene before him. A frail girl on her knees, clutching her bundle against her chest, while grown men laughed as though her misery were entertainment. His jaw tightened, the muscle in his cheek working against the storm brewing inside him. For a moment he said nothing. He simply stood there, his shadow stretching long across the dirt until it fell across the girl. The sheriff gave a mocking chuckle. "Well, now looks like the stray's found herself an audience." The crowd rippled with laughter, eager to please the man with the badge. But the cowboy didn't laugh. Instead, he took a single step forward, then another until he stood between the child and the ring of men. His silence was sharper than any curse. One townsman sneered, spitting into the dirt. "She's nothing but a stray dog, mister. Nothing worth your trouble." The cowboy's gaze cut to him, calm but unflinching. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, the kind that carried further than a shout ever could. "Then maybe you ought to fear the man who feeds the strays." The words struck like a whip crack in the stillness. For a heartbeat, the jeering stopped. The men shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, uncertain now that their cruelty had been named aloud. Without breaking his stance, the cowboy shrugged off his weathered coat. The gesture was slow, deliberate, as though to remind them that kindness could be an act of defiance. He knelt and draped the coat around the girl's narrow shoulders. The heavy fabric swallowed her frail frame, its warmth carrying a promise no words could match. She was no longer alone. The girl clutched the coat, her wide eyes brimming with silent disbelief. The crowd watched, the weight of the moment pressing down harder than any fight could. The sheriff opened his mouth, but no sound came. The simple act of a man choosing compassion had stolen the breath from the street. In that instant, the dusty town seemed to pause. No fists were raised, no threats shouted. Yet the balance of power had shifted. One man's humanity had stood taller than the cruelty of a dozen, and every soul watching knew it. The square hung in silence, the dust settling around boots and wagon wheels as if the whole town had been struck still. The girl sat hunched beneath the cowboy's coat, trembling but shielded at last. For the first time since the jeers had started, her tears were not of shame but of something she could hardly name. Relief, hope, the fragile stirring of safety. The cowboy straightened, broad shoulders casting a long shadow over her and the men who had mocked her moments before. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, steady and sure. His voice, when it came, carried no bluster, no raised tone, only the iron weight of conviction. "She rides with me now," he said, the words cutting through the murmurs like a blade through rope. "From this day forward, she is under my protection." A rancher's wife gasped, covering her mouth. The blacksmith shifted uneasily, staring at his boots. Even the sheriff faltered, his smirk slipping as the meaning settled in. This was no passing gesture. The cowboy was making a claim in front of every eye in town, binding his name to hers in a way no one could challenge without facing him first. "She's no longer nameless," the cowboy went on, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "No longer a beggar, no longer your sport. She has a place and she has my word." The sheriff tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "You don't even know her, stranger. Why take on another mouth to feed?" The cowboy's eyes narrowed, steady as stone. "Because a man's worth ain't in the gold he hoards or the land he fences. It's in the promises he keeps. And I've just made one." The girl's chest shook as she pressed a hand to her mouth, muffling the sob that broke free. Her tears spilled, not from humiliation, but from the unbearable weight of kindness after so much cruelty. She looked up at him through blurred vision, trying to understand how a drifter, a man who owed her nothing, could give her more in a single moment than the town had offered in all her lonely days. The townsmen glanced at each other, their bravado shriveling under the gaze of the cowboy who dared defy them with nothing more than decency. No fists, no weapons, only a coat, a word and a vow that rang louder than the sheriff's badge. What stunned them most wasn't the defiance. It was the claim. The loner who walked in shadows, who belonged to no one, had chosen to belong to someone at last. And by doing so, he had given dignity back to a child the town had tried to strip of it. In the end, no one answered him. No one dared. For in that dust-choked street, they all knew the truth. The cowboy hadn't just covered her shoulders with his coat. He had covered her spirit with his name. The cowboy said no more. He simply bent down, his movement slow, steady so the girl would not flinch. With one arm, he lifted her as though she weighed no more than a feather, and set her carefully in his saddle. She clutched the edges of his coat around her shoulders, wide eyes darting to the crowd, but no one dared move. The jeers had died, leaving only silence heavy as the dust that hung in the air. The cowboy swung into the saddle behind her, reins firm in his hand. For a heartbeat, he let his gaze sweep the square, meeting the eyes of sheriff and townsman alike. None of them spoke, none of them laughed. Then, with a click of his tongue, the horse surged forward, carrying them away from the sneers and cruelty of the town. The farther they rode, the softer the noise of the street grew until it was swallowed by the open prairie. The girl looked back once, then pressed her face into the coat and held on tighter. Each hoofbeat felt like a drumbeat of freedom, taking her further from the dust and humiliation, closer to something she had not known in so long, hope. By nightfall, the cowboy stopped beneath a stand of cottonwoods. The stars blinked awake overhead, and the fire he built crackled bright against the chill. From his saddlebag, he produced a small tin plate of beans and a hunk of bread. He handed it to her without ceremony, but the girl's hands trembled as she accepted it. To her, it was more than food. It was proof she mattered. She ate in silence, the firelight warming her hollow cheeks. When she finally looked across the flames, her voice was a whisper, but it carried. "Why did you help me?" The cowboy tilted his hat back, his face calm, his eyes reflecting the fire. "Because no child should face the world alone." Her breath caught, the words sinking deeper than any kindness she had ever known. Slowly, the tension in her shoulders eased, and her small frame relaxed for the first time in what felt like forever. As the night stretched wide and the fire burned low, her eyes grew heavy but not with despair. They were soft now, eased by safety, touched by trust. She curled into his coat, and before sleep claimed her, she allowed herself to believe that maybe tomorrow would be different. And in the quiet of the prairie, the truth settled like a benediction. Sometimes the smallest kindness is the greatest victory.